From the beginning, video games have caused moral controversy. This may be surprising considering games in the beginning had very little graphical detail and mostly just consisted of abstract shapes. I mean seriously, just look at the people and cars of 1976 Death Race. If you weren't told what they were supposed to be, they could easily be mistaken for turtles or really anything with arms and legs. Even so, the game caused more outrage at the time for its casual violence, even if that violence only consisted of ambiguous-looking blobs bumping into each other. The game creators said the blobs weren't supposed to be humans, but actually gremlins. However, it's understandable why this distinction didn't mean much given the aforementioned ambiguous nature of the blobs, and the fact that the game's original name was Pedestrian. From our modern perspective, the outrage over this game seems very disproportionate for what the game actually was, even laughably so. However, the outrage was still indicative of the real moral concerns that video games raise. Concerns with how seemingly anything, even the most terrible things, could be made possible for a player to do in them. 44 years later, and we still really aren't in a much better position to deal with these moral concerns than we were when Death Race was first released. As recently as 2018, the game Active Shooter, which briefly appeared on Steam, was criticized for trivializing school shootings, with families of the Parkland shooting victims arguing that keeping our kids safe is a real issue affecting our communities and is in no way a game, which is basically the exact same criticism Death Race faced in 1976 when people were arguing that the 9,000 pedestrian deaths the year before were nothing to joke about. Nowadays, most people wouldn't even bat an eye at a game like Death Race, and who knows? Maybe in 20 years nobody will care about school shooter games either. The criticisms of these games just goes to show how complicated video game morality can be, that even after 4 decades we still aren't sure which kinds of fake murder are okay to make a game about. The complications are not that surprising if we consider just how many different factors can contribute to the moral standing of actions in games. There is of course the murky and somewhat vague notion just mentioned, that everything that happens in them is fake and not real. I say vague because some people might argue that video games have a sense of realness, especially in their role-playing and fantasy-fulfilling aspects. For example, some things might be real to the player. However, it is still the case that in games no actual living creatures are involved except the player, or at least in single-player games that is the case. Multiplayer games bring in a whole host of other moral complications that could be their own separate series of videos. However, in this video I'll be putting those complications to the side to focus on single-player games where the player is the only actual living thing involved. There is also the active-passive distinction that makes games unique in regards to other media, like film and literature, and what that means for the morality of actions in games. In games, unlike other media, you aren't just sitting there, like with a book or a movie, being told everything that's going on. In a game, you are in control of much of what goes on, and in many cases, choose the things that will happen, and what actions your avatar will take. Video games also vary greatly in how they represent living things, from fairly abstract, like the crystal-like faceless people of Superhot, to Mario's cartoony, anthropomorphized mushrooms, to the straight-up, in-your-face as real as possible representations from games like The Last of Us and Assassin's Creed. Games also vary in the context in which they present these representations, from story-focused games like Telltale's The Walking Dead and BioShock that fairly strictly control almost all aspects of the context, to open-world sandbox games like Rust and Minecraft that give you a great amount of freedom to do whatever you want to do, with very little guidance, if any at all. All of these different factors in video games make the translation of our real-world morality onto their virtual one and understanding the nuances of that relationship extremely complicated. However, there are 3 general, if overly simplified, views someone could have about this relationship between morality in the real world and morality in this newer world of video games. The first view, which is the simplest, I'll call the one-to-one view. This is where someone just treats the video game world just like the real world, and everything that would be wrong to do in the real world is also wrong to do in the video game world. The second is the free-for-all view, and as you might have guessed, this is where someone thinks that morality in the real world is somehow separate from the video game world, and nothing, even the most horrible things, are wrong to do in a video game. The third and final view I call the case-by-case view. I think it is definitely the most widely held belief about the relationship between real-world morality and game-world morality. It's the view that only some things that are wrong to do in the real world are okay to do in the video game world. I want to note here that I have been using and will continue to use the term morally permissible, or sometimes just permissible, to mean the same thing as just saying something is not morally wrong to do. It does not mean that you should do it, or that it is the right or good thing to do, only that it's not wrong. Just think of morally permissible as neutral, neither morally right nor morally wrong to do. To me, like most people, case by case seems the correct description of the relationship between real-world morality and video game morality, but it is surprisingly hard to clearly say why this is and how we can decide which things are and are not permissible to do in video games. For instance, Valve has had such a hard time figuring out how to decide what it would allow on Steam that they basically gave up and went with a version of the free-for-all view in Steam's new store moderation policies in June of 2018, saying that they, quote, decided that the right approach is to allow everything onto the Steam store, except for things that we decide are illegal or straight up trolling. I don't think we should follow Valve's lead here and just throw up our hands and choose the free-for-all view, because I think there are definitely things we probably don't want people to be able to do in video games, some that are not actually illegal. Valve actually ran into this problem themselves after putting their new store policy into effect when faced with the prospect of distributing the game Rape Day in March of 2019, a game centered entirely on raping women, seemingly going against their previous, poorly defined, free-for-all-esque store policy. They refused to sell the game on their platform. Valve's response here isn't surprising. They also want to view morality in video games on a case-by-case basis, but have just been facing the same problems as everyone else when trying to find a consistent way of doing so, without it just ending up being whatever they feel like at the time. Now, what I want to do in this video is not to give a definitive answer to the problem of morality in the game world, even though there is a large body of interesting academic work that has already come up with some really interesting answers that could be good solutions. But rather instead, I want to look at how we can better understand what the problem really is with this disconnect between real-world morality and video game morality, and why it's so hard to come up with a solution to the problem. To do that, I'm going to be pulling a lot from the work of Morgan Luck and his 2009 paper, The Gamer's Dilemma. Now, the paper itself can be thought of as a challenge to the case-by-case view. Luck creates the challenge by having us think about one action in a video game that is uncontroversially permissible to do in the video game world, but not in the real world, such as torture, and one action that is uncontroversially wrong to do in a video game, and also wrong to do in the real world, such as rape. Luck in particular compares murder in a video game to pedophilia in a video game. Now, there is a dilemma, Luck argues. If a person cannot show what the relevant moral difference is between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, then they must either say that both are wrong to do in video games, or say both are permissible to do in video games. This is the gamer's dilemma. I think it's important to note before I move on that in discussing virtual pedophilia and comparing it to virtual murder, neither Luck nor I is saying that we should allow virtual pedophilia in video games, or that it is permissible to commit virtual pedophilia. The point of discussing pedophilia in this video, and the reason it's in Luck's paper, is that it is uncontroversially something people think is wrong to include in video games. So when we compare it to something that is uncontroversially permissible to have in video games, like virtual murder, we can try and see what exactly makes these two things, both clearly wrong to do in the real world, different in a way that makes one permissible to do in the game world and one not permissible to do in the game world. It could also be the case that under greater scrutiny, that we find some of the things that we think make pedophilia wrong to do in video games apply equally to certain kinds of virtual murder, making them wrong as well. The point being that the gamer's dilemma isn't arguing for the permissibility of any actions in video games in particular, but rather it's a way of trying to understand what the correct moral considerations in video games are in the first place. With all that in mind, what are the moral differences between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia? What makes murder fine in video games, but pedophilia wrong? How do we get around the gamer's dilemma? One answer to why murder is permissible in video games would be that murder in games isn't real, and no one is actually being harmed. Only ones and zeros on a computer. However, the same can be said about pedophilia, and many other things we think would be wrong to do in a game. The virtual children are only ones and zeros on a computer after all. I bring up this answer only because it's widely used in defense of violence in games, when that violence is criticized. and I want to show how easily many of the defenses of one kind of action in a game can be used to defend much more problematic actions. So although this is perfectly fine for those that have the free-for-all view of video game morality, it is not a good answer for people that want to have the case-by-case view, because it offers no way to differentiate between wrong actions in video games. Murder being permissible in games because no one is actually murdered can't help with the gamer's dilemma. Luckily, Luck discusses other possible answers to the dilemma in his paper that do have a chance at solving the dilemma, and I will be discussing 3 of them in this video. This one is another highly popular argument made for and against the permissibility of certain actions in games. Most recently, it has been brought up as a reason for why mass shootings have been more prevalent in the United States. The argument goes that if someone commits certain real-world immoral actions, such as murder, in a video game, then they will be more likely to commit those actions in the real world. So, committing murder in a video game is not permissible, because it increases the likelihood of real-world murder. Now, this argument has mostly been proven false for general violence in video games, or at least it hasn't been shown that it significantly increases the likelihood of real-world violence. But those who want to use it to solve the gamer's dilemma argue that this is not the case for virtual pedophilia, and that pedophilia in video games does significantly increase the likelihood of someone committing pedophilia in the real world. If this is in fact true, it would solve the dilemma, because murder and pedophilia would have the morally relevant difference in that one does not lead to real-world consequences and one does. The problem with this argument is its reliance on psychological evidence to make its point, some of which doesn't even exist yet. There is an abundance of studies done on the effects of violent games on the likeliness of people being violent in real life, but as I just said, it's far from conclusive that there even is an effect on real-world violence, and even some evidence that the effect it has is to actually reduce real-world violence. For obvious reasons, there aren't enough studies on the effects of virtual pedophilia because there aren't millions of people playing games that contain it. So if all we have to go on is the data on violent games to decide a game's real-world consequences, then it looks like, without any other information, that it is likely that virtual pedophilia wouldn't increase the likelihood of real-world pedophilia either. It may actually reduce it. This gets to the root of Luck's problem with the argument, which is that since it gets its strength from looking at the supposed negative consequences of virtual pedophilia on the real world, it also needs to take into account any positive consequences. For instance, if it was found that virtual pedophilia actually lessened the likelihood that someone would commit real-world pedophilia, then those relying on this argument would be forced to say that the moral thing to do would actually be to put virtual pedophilia in games so as to protect real children. Since this would make virtual pedophilia permissible, and even possibly obligatory, this argument would still not give us any morally relevant differences between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, and so it would not solve the gamer's dilemma. The next argument Luck brings up is one of the stronger ones, in my opinion, because it looks at the effects immoral actions might have on the character of the person doing them in-game, not just at the harm that might be done to others by those actions in the real world. It also is a simpler version of one of the arguments I want to look at in a future video that directly responds to Luck's gamer's dilemma. The argument goes that when we are murdering in video games, it's not the murder itself that makes the game enjoyable, but rather it's the accomplishment of goals and the love of competition. We enjoy the challenge, and if some people or Goombas are killed along the way, well, that's merely incidental. We wouldn't actually enjoy murdering in the real world, and it would show bad character if we did. On the other hand, no person with a good character would ever commit virtual pedophilia, because the only reason to do so is if you would enjoy doing it in the real world, and it is wrong and a character flaw to feed a desire to commit virtual pedophilia in the real world, just like it would be wrong to feed a desire for real-world murder. Unvirtuous actions done in the game world, even if they don't hurt others, are reflective of the kind of person doing them and their desires. So murder is permissible in video games because it can be done in a way where a person isn't enjoying the action in itself, so it doesn't harm their character. And pedophilia is not permissible in games because it can only be done for the pleasure and enjoyment of the action in itself, and so it will always harm a person's character. There are 2 objections that Luck brings up for this argument. The first, I think, is the weaker one, and it just asks why there couldn't be a game that uses pedophilia instrumentally, like murder is used in many games. Couldn't, for instance, there be a game where you were in medieval times and you needed to marry and produce an heir with a 14-year-old to gain land and power? In this game, you could be someone that doesn't desire to commit pedophilia in the real world, but are only doing what is necessary to progress through the game. The argument focuses on desires and intent as being the morally important factors for whether pedophilia is permissible in games, and in doing so, makes pedophilia in them not inherently wrong. Pedophilia, then, just has to be done with the right attitude, like with murder. A person can do it in a game as long as they are not wanting to do it in real life. The second, much stronger objection Luck makes is to dispute that people who murder in games aren't partially enjoying the murder itself. In other words, for a lot of people that play games, murder isn't just a tool, but part of the fun of the game. Luck also makes the point that game developers seem to know this, and it's why many games involve highly detailed simulations of killing. People seem to really enjoy being able to run over pedestrians for no reason. From Death Race to Grand Theft Auto, being able to inhabit a fantasy world where you can break all the rules is something people seem to love. So this argument, as it is, fails to solve the gamer's dilemma, because it's just not clear whether people wouldn't be able to commit pedophilia in a game while not enjoying it, and it seems absolutely clear that many people who murder in games really do enjoy the murder itself. The unfairly singling out a group for harm argument isn't as general as Luck's previous 3 arguments, and can't be used as a reason to keep all the things we don't want in games out, but I still wanted to discuss it because it actually applies to quite a few of them. I think it's easiest to see how this argument works if we look at an example for when it would apply to virtual murder. Even if virtual murder is permissible in video games, it would seem not permissible if a game was about murdering only Muslims or only people who were gay. In this case, in playing this game, you would be unfairly targeting a group for murder, and this immoral prejudice would make playing a game like this immoral. The argument works the same for virtual pedophilia, except the group you are unfairly targeting here is children. This argument could also apply to the game Rape Day. Since the game focuses only on raping women, the game would be unfairly targeting women for the harm of rape. Even though no one is being harmed by the virtual action, it would still be immoral because it is taking part in an immoral prejudice. The ubiquity of hate crime laws around the world also gives strong evidence for this argument, because in the real world, we treat crimes that target specific groups as worse than the same crimes done more randomly. There are 2 objections that Luck has for this argument. One is that to him, it's not clear why virtual pedophilia is worse than random virtual murder, even if it is targeting a specific group. For instance, it's not clear that targeting a specific group for harm makes an immoral action so much worse that it outweighs the harm of a different immoral action performed more randomly. Without unfairly targeting a group for harm being significantly worse than a random harm, it's not clear to Luck that we can really show that virtual pedophilia is worse than virtual murder. Because of the reason I mentioned earlier, that there is a prevalence of hate crime laws, I find this first objection of his weak and not very convincing, especially if you think we should add the condition that it's even worse if the unfairly targeted group is a vulnerable community, like the transgender community. So the fact that the community of children could be seen as an especially vulnerable community would be a good reason for thinking virtual pedophilia is worse than random virtual murder. Luck's second objection sidesteps the problems with his first by just granting to the argument that unfairly targeting a group for harm is wrong. However, an easy solution presents itself now. Just make a game where you can molest every person equally, young or old, man or woman. This new game would then make virtual pedophilia permissible to do and put in games because no one would be unfairly targeted. So this last argument too fails to solve the gamer's dilemma. So where does this leave us with morality in the game world? Well, I think it's important to remember that even though Luck only talks about the relationship between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, the arguments discussed and the dilemma they create can be generalized to most, if not all, questions of video game morality. Without new arguments or improvements to the arguments discussed in this video, for any 2 real-world wrong actions, such as murder and rape, if we cannot come up with a good argument to differentiate them that says why one is permissible in game and one is not, then we must treat them the same way in order to be consistent. That means either thinking that they are both permissible to do in video games, or that they are both wrong to do in video games. If this is the case for all immoral actions in games, and we can't find a way to differentiate any of them, then we are stuck with either the one-to-one view or the free-for-all view of video game morality. This is not a fun position to be in if you like how game morality is treated right now, and wish to keep playing games like Assassin's Creed and Red Dead Redemption. However, like I said, I personally do think case by case is the right view, so I'm not trying to say we should all stop playing our violent video games, or that we all should start playing games with pedophilia and rape. I'm only arguing that this view isn't a given, that there is a real problem with deciding which actions in games are permissible and which actions are not. There is some real thought that needs to be put into how we treat morality in video games, because the very same arguments used in the 70s to criticize violence in Death Race are being used again to criticize games like Rape Day. I understand the worry many people have over the fear-mongering and moral panic video games have faced and continue to face, much of which I agree is undeserved. However, I do think that beneath the panic are some real problems that need to be addressed. Like how many people seem to feel games have a real separateness from the real world when it comes to general violence, but a deep closeness to the real world when it comes to sexual violence. I think this disconnect should be worrying people more than it is, because the game world is just going to keep getting more real. But what do you all think about the gamer's dilemma? Can the case-by-case view be saved? Do you even think it should be saved? Do you instead find yourself agreeing more with the one-to-one or free-for-all views? Let me know.